All right, Bradley Kramer, welcome to Quick Show. Just a quick background on Bradley. You hold an MA in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a BA in English from Brigham Young University with a minor in Near Eastern Studies. You are also very involved with the interfaith efforts that many of us try to be involved with on the Jewish side. So you are a participant in Torah and Talmud classes, which I am also, at a local synagogue in Durham, North Carolina, and you've helped arrange joint Mormon Jewish study sessions and other educational exchanges. And you've given presentations to local and regional groups on the affinities between Mormons and Jews. Would love to hear more about that. And you're a regular speaker at comparative religion classes. Most importantly, for our discussion today, you have written a book, I think it was 2019 when it came out, Gathered in One, how
yes,
the book
right before the pandemic.
Right before the pandemic. Okay, good reading for the pandemic. Gathered in One, how the Book of Mormon counters anti-Semitism in the New Testament. And the thing that really intrigues me about this, Bradley, is and the reason I asked you to come on is because what I have seen in the Book of Mormon and in the LDS community is there's not, we don't have enough, I think, of a discussion about how the Book of Mormon applies to the Jews. We talk a lot about, hey, most of us are Gentiles, so it's, okay,
Sure.
This is talking to us in the latter days. And of course, bringing it to the Lamanites as well. But there's not a lot of discussion about the importance of how the Book of Mormon speaks to the Jews, and bringing up, of course, anti-Semitism, which has historically been a huge issue and a conflict between Christianity and Judaism, it's a great opportunity to, I think, not only help mend some relational issues between Christianity and Judaism, but shine a light on the Book of Mormon. And so I wanted to start off just by asking you, what is it? You've got background, obviously, here with interfaith efforts, but what is it that brought you to write this book?
Well, it's really a long story in many ways. I'll try to shorten it. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Greg.
Sure.
I grew up in Cincinnati, and there weren't very many Mormon or LDS congregations at the time, maybe one or two. My father never was a member of the church in my school systems. I was the only member. So I grew up kind of very much an extreme minority. And when I started to become aware of religious things and eager to find some answers, I found a lot of affinity with some of the novels of Chaim Patak, if you've ever read any of his. In the Beginning, The Chosen, The Promise, this sort of thing, where there are basically Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are trying to navigate their way through a similar problem as a small minority, very different from me, but still approaching these things in an intelligent and spiritual way. And even though they would speak differently, dress differently, have a slightly different views of things, I felt quite an affinity with these Jewish people. And as a consequence, well, actually, it's kind of like my understanding of Judaism and appreciation of Jews kind of went along with my understanding and appreciation of the Latter-day Saint faith. Because as I'm growing and becoming more connected with these things, I'm also learning about Judaism. I go to BYU, I learn a lot more about the settling of the Great Basin in this area, and I'm also learning about the development of the state of Israel, the ways of people going there. I took Hebrew at the time, and because I had a whole year of modern Hebrew and was interested in the Jews, my mission president, who had gone to some conferences about missionaries to the Jews in other places, and this is down in Florida, in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, decided to dub me his Jewish program. And he said, basically, anything I want to do, anything I want to read, that's fine. And so I'm not exactly God's gift to the Jews, not a lot of great conversions or anything, but I did a lot of talking with Jewish people, learned to appreciate them, their humor, their friendliness, their inquisitiveness. And as I'm studying the Book of Mormon, I'm noticing some of the very things that you're talking about, how much it talks about that this is one of its prime audience. The Jews are one of the prime audiences. They talk a lot about Jews in the Book of Mormon, and I noticed a number of things there, and had a special project on my mission to write down a number of these things. And this coincided later on. I went into literature, English literature, including Old English, which is why I know about the name of your site.
Very impressive.
Anyway, I brought back some pleasant memories. But I studied in graduate school here at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And at that time, there was an LDS professor of English who was really the pioneer of approaching the Book of Mormon literarily. This is Richard Rust. He later on wrote a book about that subject. We would study together, almost like a one-on-one sort of thing. And it coincided with the way I had learned that Jews approached the Book of Mormon. And so this, after many years of studying this and thinking about it, started inquiring as far as my study habits, if the Book of Mormon was written to the Jews, what does it say about them? And I divided this into three different main categories. And these are the main problems that Jews have with Christianity. They have a problem with the New Testament, the Christian Bible. So what does it say about that? They have a problem with Christian history, the persecution they've gone through there, what the Book of Mormon says about that. And they have a problem with Christ, with Jesus, why he didn't come in the way that they were expecting. And I did this study project, maybe 10 years ago or something, came out with this huge volume, which is totally unpublishable, but then used that material to then come up with so far 2 books, not only gathered in the one that you talked about, but also Beholding the Tree of Life, which is a rabbinic approach to the Book of Mormon, which uses some of these rabbinic literary techniques on the Book of Mormon to mine it for more meaning. So in a short, that's not very short, but still,
we're past short, but that's okay. I want to hear it all.
And how this book evolved from those sorts of things.
Okay, so let's approach this first, similar to the way that you did in the book. Let's approach this first as to how is it basically in your book. What you're showing is how the New Testament can be anti-Semitic. And in fact, the way I interpreted it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you show how it is anti-Semitic in some cases because of probably the environment, the reaction, those that are writing. And then secondly, before we get into the Book of Mormon, how much of that is interpretation in Christianity since the time of the compilation of the New Testament, and how much of it is really in the New Testament that you see that is specifically anti-Semitic?
Sure, and it's appropriate we talk about this early on because this is probably the main challenge that most of my readers have with my book. They don't have too much problem with what the Book of Mormon says about Jews, but they have a big problem if I somehow color the New Testament as an anti-Semitic book. And I try to introduce this as gradually and as sensitively as I can. I mean, it's certainly a Jewish problem. Jews who read the New Testament find this very, very offensive, very offensive not only to them, but on the offense. Mm-hmm. You know, it's attacking them in many ways. But this is mirrored by many Christian scholars who love the New Testament, who revere the New Testament, who are in many cases ministers of traditional Christian faiths. And they admit this as well. And part of it is certainly what we've done with the New Testament and the situation that has changed since the time the New Testament was written. But I believe the New Testament it was conceived, the way the Gospels are put together with a certain amount of an anti-Semitic slant. Now, the problem with that is that anti-Semitism to us now means the Holocaust. It means Auschwitz. It means the Nazis. It means these terrible oppressions and that sort of thing. And at the time the New Testament, or especially the Gospels, were put together, which is the later third of the first century, I don't think it meant that sort of thing. You have a small group of believers in Jesus, basically, and they're more and more Gentile rather than Jewish, and they're they're in competition with Judaism, for one, because they're kind of saying, basically the Hebrew scriptures are now the Old Testament. It's part of our canon. They all testify of Jesus versus the Jewish approach. Many of the concepts in Judaism of sin, of forgiveness, of atonement, of Messiah, Messianic era, all come from Judaism. So really, what's the difference between these two? So there's a certain amount of competition going on, and there's a certain amount of bad feeling. The Jews don't like the fact that the Christians came out of Judaism and essentially seem to say that they have a better way here.
Well, it's like an usurping, right? They're trying to usurp their religion. Is this how I would think they would look
definitely.
at it?
And there's the idea of supersessionism, superseding, replacing that is certainly part of that. But I think, again, there's this polemic of kind of saying we're better than the Jews. And Judaism at that time is developing rabbinic Judaism. The modern form of Judaism without the temple, without sacrifices, is being formed at the very time that Christianity is being formed. So there's this tension. And if you're a small oppressed group, occasional pointing out about how we're better than the other group is not terribly offensive. It's you're building up a confidence, the esprit de corps. You're trying to help the people. And so as long as the Christians were a small, impotent, somewhat oppressed minority, that kind of anti-Semitism really isn't much of a problem. But then along comes Constantine later on, and it becomes a state religion, and now it becomes allied with the Roman government and the Roman army and the populace and sort of thing. And so now it's almost kind of like it has weaponized this kind of competitive feeling sort of thing. And so now the anti-Semitism in the New Testament becomes very dangerous. You can now use it to oppress the Jews, which certainly happens during that time and later on. I've tried to think of an analogy, and this doesn't work very well, but it's almost like in a number of Latter-day Saint hymns and songs and other things, after the martyrdom of Joseph and the expulsion from Missouri and Illinois, there were these kind of anti-Illinois, anti-Missouri pieces. I think it's even part of the song Praise to the Man in some ways. It's something about Illinois. And it's not that big a deal. They're just trying to deal with it. Well, what if those things were still preserved? And what if somehow our church was now allied with this empire who could now oppress these people? Would that then become a way of not anti-Semitism, but anti-Illinoisism or something like that? You can see how that might serve as a terrible sort of thing for these people, maybe even oppressive. Again, it's not a complete analogy, but I think that's the situation has really, really changed. These things that were kind of not very powerful jabs at another faith now became condemnations and led to severe oppressions after that.
Real quick, I'm going to interject something you brought up, the Holocaust. Based on your relationships with your Jewish friends and attending synagogue and other things, and what is your feeling on, is Christianity to blame for that to some degree? Is that separate? Is that, because there's a lot of things that go into anti-Semitism, right? Especially from a European side. I mean, you have great anti-Semitism in the Middle East, but from a European side and we'll call it a Western side, I think there's a lot of, you can look at Christianity, but there's also the idea of the other, right? Somebody who is hanging on to millennia of tradition and of religion, and yet they're not a part of your, in that sense, they're not a part of your nation, perhaps, or of your people. And so it seems like there's a lot that can go into that. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think certainly society contributed a great deal. I mean, these are foreigners. They have a different language, the different culture. They wear different things, eat different things. They come in and they may take some jobs that you are interested in. A lot of places Jews went into, they were kind of the middle people between the nobles and the peasants, and they're there to enforce some of these taxes and other sorts of things. And so they're the common people are seeing them as oppressors, not foreigners, but also the tools of these oppressors. And the nobles are not particularly thrilled with them because they're not part of them. They're just using these folks. And so they're kind of these people in between.
Strangers in a strange land.
It's very much a strangers. But on the other hand, Christianity, the church in general, has had a lot to do with this as well. I mean, Augustine came up with the idea. He basically likened Jews to Cain, and Cain, the original murderer, and they believe the Jews were all of them were murderers of Jesus and continue to be in their hearts. Suffer the same punishment. They're not killed, but they're condemned to wander upon the earth as kind of vagabonds and never have a very good place. And so the policy with Augustine was not to kill Jews, but to basically make sure they didn't succeed, that they lived in poor circumstances, in poor places, were limited as far as what kind of jobs that they could do, not really involved. And a lot of this kind of changed around the time of the Crusades. Around 1090, basically, Pope Urban II called upon the Europe, basically, to come and rescue Jerusalem, to free Jerusalem from the infidel, and to do it with the force of arms. And this gave rise to basically two strands of this crusade. One was led by nobles and knights, and they're very organized, but there was also a mob that basically decided to go from Europe to Jerusalem. Partly this was set up again as a way of forgiveness for sins. So as a religious basement, you make the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, you help free Jerusalem, and in many ways your sins are forgiven you, a kind of indulgence. And along the way, they figured, well, we don't have to go all the way to Jerusalem to deal with an infidel. There are plenty of infidel Jews in our area. And so there were these huge massacres along the Rhine area, both in Germany and in eastern France, where these people would sometimes try to convert them or kill them, and just kill them. And this happened basically all the way as the mob is working its way to Jerusalem. And then once the more heavily armed force captured Jerusalem, it killed all the Muslims and the Jews within Jerusalem. So there's almost like a church-sanctioned oppression that's at least encouraged at that time. And then again, you get things like the superstitions. Along comes the plagues. Who caused the plagues? Well, it's probably the Jews, because they're not Christians. They're bringing this divine wrath upon us. There are strange rumors. A child goes missing, and they somehow believe that the Jews have killed him, because Jews need Christian blood to make their matzah for Passover. This is
I have heard that.
A common thing, and all the Jews are in. There's no blood in this, and even one of the biggest charges I'm sure you want to get to is the idea that in Matthew, where the Jewish crowd cries that to Jesus, let his blood be upon us and our children. Well, this kind of thing is recited on Good Friday services, and often led to mobs going after the Jews, maybe destroying property, maybe even injuring them and killing them. I mean, there is an intermixture of Christianity in this oppression all the way, of keeping the Jews down, of thinking of them as the infidels, of making their life rough. That seems to be tied together. I mean, it's kind of hard to separate society and tradition with doctrine, because these things are so much intertwined. But
Sure.
there's certainly a traditional Christian involvement.
Let's get into the New Testament then, and talk a little bit more about that.
Let me say one thing, is that when I meet with my Jewish friends and they ask me about Christianity, I'm pretty careful to say that as a Mormon, as a Latter-day Saint, I'm a non-traditional Christian. I try to do my very best to separate myself from this Christian history, which we do not, feel that we're part of. We feel that this is, apostate. This has gone wrong. We're not part of this. And I think that's really, really important to Jewish people to know, that we don't come out of that tradition. We're not in any way sanctioning or justifying what has done before with Jews. We're separate. And so I try to emphasize
good tip
that.
when talking with Jewish people. Yes.
Sure.
Definitely. Going into the blood curse in Matthew, you brought up in the book, this is the only place in the New Testament that in the Gospels that this is brought up.
Right.
What is happening there? Why do you think that's written in Matthew? How obviously it's been interpreted through the centuries in a way that, okay, the whole, scattering of the Jews is because of this, and et cetera, and they've called this upon themselves. But in the actual writing there with Matthew, is that something that should not be there then, if that's purely an anti-Semitic sentiment?
Interestingly, when I wrote the chapter on the anti-Semitic elements of the New Testament, I really started with this because in this day and age, I don't know of a single Christian that holds that as true. Number one, could someone actually claim, okay, have this sin be upon not only myself, but upon my children forever? Most people just say, well, that's obviously wrong. They can't do that for that sort of thing. Others have looked historically and say that there's no record of outside of the book of Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, of a Roman prefect ever doing anything like this. And they would probably say also, it just doesn't make any sense. Would you allow the most seditious, the most rebellious, the most dangerous, the most murderous criminal to go free because the people want it? If you're in charge of an empire, I mean, there's a lot of things that just really don't make any sense about this. And so as a result, a number of churches have basically edited this out of their presentation. When they go over what happens on Good Friday, they don't bring this up. In a sense, it's still in their
Is that a recent editing then?
Well, a lot has happened since Vatican II in the early 60s, and Nostra Aetate, in our times, there's a lot to say about how the church is trying to, the Catholic Church is basically trying to repent of their past and trying to make sure that Jews are not oppressed. That they don't see this as coming directly out of the scriptures, and it kind of affirms basically a respect for Judaism. And many churches have followed suit in many ways because afterwards. And so you'll find this in a number of churches where it's still in their scriptures, but they just won't read this part. Or if they come across other parts in the New Testament, they'll have a long explanation. There even are versions of the New Testament that rewrite things. The book of Gospel of John, for instance, it's no longer the Pharisees who are oppressing Jesus, it's the Jews proper. And there are versions of the New Testament that just rewrite this. They'll say the elders of the Jews, or the people, or something of this sort, which is not true for the Greek at all. But this is just a way of rewriting it for our time according to their beliefs.
Mm-hmm. I look at that, and to me, especially in Matthew, it seems to me like what is being done there is they're creating a ritual of the Day of Atonement, right? Where you've got Pilate up there as the high priest. You have the two goats in Christ and in
Barabbas.
What's that?
Barabbas.
Barabbas, thank you. And in fact, which means, son of the Father.
Son of the Father.
And, yeah, so they're like two identical goats that you would have the Day of Atonement, and then there's a judgment as to which one are we going to sacrifice and which one are we going to let go, right? That's going to be, say, sent out of the walls of Jerusalem. And part of that ritual is that as the high priest then takes the blood of the ox and of the goat, that he's going to go and he cleanses the altar, he cleanses the temple, he goes into the Holy of Holies on the Ark of the Covenant, and he cleanses himself, but then he also cleanses the people, right? And whether that's symbolic or he actually uses the blood on the people, I don't know, but that is in the Old Testament, right? He sprinkles the blood basically on the people. And so I look at it like, well, is there a way that, what they're really trying to do is write this as a Day of Atonement. And that's why it's included in there.
It's possible. There are other people who have suggested this. So basically, we're all trying to take his blood upon us, and somehow, so it somehow forgives us of our sins. And perhaps that was something in the mind of the writer of the Book of Matthew. I don't know that other things coincide with that, but you have to know too that that's very offensive to Jews, because it's basically saying, once again, Jesus is the atoning sacrifice. He's the one is at free and the other one's going there. So they're rereading that whole history as somehow these Jews at that time were crying out to be saved and be saved through Jesus's sacrifice, even if they're doing that implicitly. So that may have had an early Christian meaning, perhaps, I don't know. But again, for a Jewish reader, it's quite offensive.
I don't see that interpretation at all there, but sure. Now, and one other thing that I've noticed a lot in speaking with several Jews is that it's not necessarily what is offensive is the claim that he's the Messiah. I mean, of course, they don't believe that, but it's not that he's the Messiah, right? Or there's been several false messiahs that they haven't had issues with, such big issues with, right, since the time of Christ. But it's that he's claiming that he's divine, right? He's the Son of God. And John seems to write his gospel kind of with that in mind. He wants to make sure that, hey, this is not just the Messiah, but the claim on this specifically is that he is Christ, the Son of God. Is that something you have found as well?
Sure. It's almost like they're different concepts entirely without much intersection, because the Jewish Messiah is supposed to be a human being. He's supposed to come to everyone openly. He's supposed to then bring to pass a messianic era with justice, peace, mercy, righteousness, all through the whole sorts of thing. And it's supposed to be done on this earth life. So that's basically the Jewish Messiah. And then the Christian Christ really is someone who comes privately. Only a few people know about him. He's there to redeem people from their sins. This is something that has to do more or less with the afterlife, not so much in this life. It's almost like these kind of separate ideas that have very little crossover. The interesting thing for me is the Book of Mormon bridges the two, because in the Book of Mormon, Jesus is both a Christ, the Christian Savior, the Savior from sin, but he's also a Jewish Redeemer of the world, which you get into like a taste of that with 4th Nephi. But that's the intersection, and that's the difference between the two. And many Jews will just simply say, Jesus can't be the Messiah because he didn't do what the Messiah came. The world is still in a mess. We're not in a messianic era. There's still injustice. There's still oppression. There's still war. Like Isaiah predicted the Messiah would, and so there's no choice. But also what we talked about with Christian history, that's a huge part of Christian Jewish relations, because Judaism is not a religion based so much on belief like Christians. You don't have a code or a creed that you ascribe to, and you can kind of say all Jews of this persuasion believe this or this. It's more or less of behavior, of what you do, of how you treat other people, and that sort of thing. But so as a result, Jews can believe all sorts of things. One of the Torah classes I go to is a Reform, which is one of the more liberal ones. And there are people there who openly just say they don't believe in God, but they're Jews. They go to synagogue, they'll read the Torah, that sort of thing. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in miracles. A lot of things that happen in the Bible, they don't particularly believe that they happen that way either. Another group is a conservative, which is a little bit more believing. My interaction with them is mostly on Zoom, so we haven't had as many private conversations, but I suspect that more of them believe in God, and they believe in the scriptures a little bit more close to what they say. So you can almost believe anything you want as a Jew, except that Jesus was the Christ. And I think that part of that is not only the difference in concept, but this antipathy that we've created, that Christians have created over the centuries, that now Christians are the enemy. If you go over to the Christians, you have renounced Judaism, you have gone over to the other side, you are now an enemy to this. So that history has a huge impact, I believe, in Jewish-Christian relations and in their view of Jesus too. And other things. I mean, you've got crucifixes. To them, that's an idol, and especially an idol of someone who has died, and you're blamed for his death there in front of your. That's a very graphic demonstration as to some of the differences, and even to them how Christians feel about Jews.
Sure. Sticking in with the New Testament here, you've got something on challenging Pharisaism. Is that how I'm going to say that? Pharisaism.
Pharisaism, yeah,
okay,
Pharisaic,
good enough. Okay, here's what you say. I'm quoting you. You say, these synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, similarly promote supersessionist ideas, that would be from the Christians, by describing Jews in condemnatory terms. However, these gospels do so not directly by blaming the Jews explicitly. Instead, they do so implicitly through the Pharisees. Such a portrayal is neither fair nor historically accurate. Why is it not fair, and why is it not accurate?
First of all, why do they do this? This is the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John does blame the Jews explicitly. And why do they do this? Well, again, Christianity is forming about the same time as Rabbinic Judaism. The temple was destroyed in 70, and you, as a Jew, what do? You can't offer sacrifices. You can't go to the temple. You're scattered. And they turn to a study of the sacrifices, and study is equivalent to performing them. And so, study, prayer, meeting in the synagogue, that basically replaces the old style temple-oriented Judaism. And there are several groups that you hear about. You hear about certainly the Pharisees in the New Testament, the Sadducees. You hear a little bit about the Zealots, and we know a lot about the Essenes and the Dead Sea folks, that sort of thing. Well, the Sadducees are basically the priests. These are the high priests. This is Annas and Caiaphas and the rest of these guys. They no longer have a temple, so they no longer have really a power base.
And they were more the elitists, right? They'd be more the aristocracy kind of the Jewish.
I mean, sure. That's interesting, because oftentimes you think of Pharisees as being the rich, wealthy, hobnob people. In many ways, it was the Sadducees. These were the ones who were Hellenized, who have rich houses. And this is, I have some friends who are archaeologists in Jerusalem, and they find homes of Sadducees, and they're the priests, and they're very wealthy, kind of living off of the temple.
And the Pharisees are more like the from the people. They're for the people.
The Pharisees? The
Pharisees, yeah, that's what I've always interpreted as that.
Yeah, and the Pharisees are the people who will go out in the synagogues and reach the people, and they're they characterize them as the poor scholars versus the rich aristocrats, which are more of the Sadducees. And so anyway, and the Essenes are just basically destroyed by the Romans. The Romans win the war, so there's no point for the Zealots. So the only group that's really carrying on is the Pharisees. The Pharisees are really the ancestors of modern Rabbinic Judaism. Their approach and that sort of thing is then preserved later on in the Mishnah and then the Gemara and that sorts of things. So that sort of thing. So why go after the Pharisees? The Pharisees are really essentially the Jews that they're dealing with in the later part of the first century and in the second century. No.
Well, let me interrupt you there just a second, though. Okay, so are you saying?
I didn't get back to your question yet. Sorry.
Yeah. Are you saying that the authors of the Synoptic Gospels placed this in there after the fact because they're writing decades later, because of the conflict and the rivalry with Judaism, or for example, because I mean Christ, Jesus specifically is given words there that he spoke about the Pharisees over and over again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Am I saying that? Yes, I'm saying that.
Okay.
And that's what I mean. Just to kind of review as far as when the Gospels were written. I mean, they had to be after Jesus died, so they're after the 30s. Paul writes about in the 50s. He doesn't mention anything about these stories. And then there's some things in Mark that kind of allude to the idea that the temple has been destroyed. So many scholars, and this is all guesswork in many ways, I think that basically he wrote in the later 60s or 70s, basically. So it's long. And the other part is that the Gospels are all written in Greek. The original apostles were fairly more or less illiterate fishermen and other working people, and they spoke Aramaic. So how did they acquire not only Greek, but a facility with the language to write a long letter like this? So it's much later. So it's later on, and then also you can see that how Luke and Matthew are built upon Mark. So they have, they not only quote, you can see it in English where they quote several things and then add to it, but also I'm told from my Greek scholar friends that even the Greek is the same in lots of ways. So they have Mark in front of them and they're adding to it what they have heard. Oftentimes, and this is an oral tradition. These apostles and disciples are going around telling people the stories of Jesus and that sort of thing. And eventually they're dying out and people are trying to write them down as best they can. And maybe their versions are slightly different and maybe the context was presented slightly differently. So basically, that's what's happening in Matthew and Luke. They're taking Mark and then adjusting it to what else they've heard in other situations. And many of them, especially Matthew, it does add some extra stuff about the Pharisees in there that's not in Mark. So where did that exactly come from? Is that true to what Jesus said? Is it true to his spirit of what he said according to these people? It's hard to say. But it does set them up as different from the Pharisees. And it does make the Pharisees look kind of, hypocritical and murderous and kind of don't present them in a very good light. And this is one of the points that I make. We don't notice it as well because it's a literary approach. There are so many things that come together, and it's not just how the Pharisees are portrayed, which you can say, well, that's just the Pharisees. They're not talking about the rest of the Jews. But then how do the other Jews in the New Testament come across? How the Pharisees, Sadducees are presented fairly evilly. Herod is not very good. Even the Jewish crowds, they'll welcome Jesus coming into Jerusalem with palm fronds, and yet in Matthew, they're also crying out for his blood later on. So they seem very fickle in some ways. So you've got all these things that kind of come together. And it's not just, the portrayals, but the statements like his blood be upon us and our children, some of the parables that talk about how the covenant will be taken away from the Jews and given to someone else. And even, some of the settings of certain things, as well as in my book, I talk about, the statements, the portrayals, the settings, and then the basic structure of the New Testament kind of all puts together to kind of woo you, sometimes subtly, very literarily, to a anti-Semitic point of view.
I want to get to that in just one second. I've got one more thing I want to bring up before we go into that.
I didn't answer your original question.
Oh, go, please. Bring it on. I forget these things. So
okay, fine. So did I.
Did you say you had more answer to give?
No.
Oh,
There was a question you asked, and then I was giving background on how the New Testament was
was
formed.
it fair and was it historical?
Oh, okay.
Historically accurate. You kind of did go to those things.
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated. Is it fair? I don't think so. I mean, look at the way the law of Moses is presented in the New Testament. I mean, if you just had the Gospels, what would you think was the main thing you should do on the Sabbath day?
I don't know. Go to church.
No, it doesn't say it. It says the thing you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath day is you're not supposed to do good, and that's
Oh,
it.
okay.
There's nothing about, the Sabbath is a holy day set aside for you to worship, be with your family,
I
rest from
gotcha.
your labors. It's just, this is a day that you can't do good, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Even if you think of Jesus healing, he's not really working at this. He's basically telling somebody to be healed, or putting his hand on them, or putting some mud on their eye or something of that sort. That's not really very much work, but why? But that's almost a caricature, an unfair caricature of the law of Moses. Same sorts of things with some of the purity laws and that sort of thing that happened in the New Testament.
But wouldn't those things be where, again, I think I'm getting to this question here in a minute, but isn't there a difference here between different sects of Jews, like you went into, a difference between an aristocracy and those in power, and those that, for example, appearing that you can't do anything on the Sabbath? Is that in some ways the majority of Jews are oppressed at the time from the aristocracy, the Jewish aristocracy, because of all of the additional things that are laid upon them above and beyond what is even dictated in the law of Moses? And so they're almost all, it seems to me, in a position of being oppressed by their own people, by a small group that are in power at the time. That's the way I read that. And I was going to ask you the question, you talk a lot about in the book about narrowing down the number of Jews that may have been involved with leading Jesus to be crucified, right? And I think that's true. I think that's very true. I can't tell you how many times over the last number of years I've had pushback from members of the church that say, well, the Jews welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem at the beginning of the Holy Week, but then look what they did. They turned around and they cried for his blood at the end, for him to die. And they're not that fickle. To me, that's preposterous. I mean, you look back in it and you see, what is the practicality of that happening within a few days? That's, to me, it's a different group of people. You have a group of people that are followers of Christ. They're Jews. Remember, we're at Passover here. These could be people from a lot of different areas in the diaspora that have come into Jerusalem. And they're followers of Jesus. They believe in him. He is the king. I don't believe this is a triumphal entry. I believe this is a royal procession. That's, I think, exactly what it is. And they're doing what you would do with a king at a royal procession. They believe he's the king, and he's coming in to go to the temple, which is what you would do. And then a few days later, you have others riled up by those in power that are calling for the death of Jesus, especially after he's gone with Annas and Caiaphas and declared that he is the Son of God, right? That to me is the real big issue there. He's claiming to be divine. He's Jehovah, right? Jesus is Lord means Jesus is Jehovah. So I completely agree with you that you can narrow down significantly those that would have been responsible for killing Jesus. And that these are, I believe, different peoples. You can't throw all the Jews, not only the Jews from the first century, but to the Jews today, but the actual Jews that are there in Jerusalem. Again, it's during Passover. You've got the majority of those people have nothing to do with Jerusalem other than the pilgrimage to the temple.
Well, there's a lot of things to think about. I mean, like you're saying, if these are basically believers in Jesus who have welcomed him in when he's riding in on a donkey, but he's been in Galilee the whole time. According to the synoptics, this is his first time into Jerusalem. where do these people come from? I mean, these are all Galileans who've come down, after the Sermon on the Mount, they traveled down there with him. They're there welcoming him. It's hard to say. There's a lot of things that you kind of wonder, how could this really be? So it could be that sort of thing. I mean, that's certainly the way Matthew 27 really tries to paint the Barabbas incident. It's on 20. I got it here on the wall here. But the chief priests and the elders persuade the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. But then when Pilate asks again, what evil has he done? They cried out the more, saying, let him be crucified, almost as if they're doing this now on their own. They're no longer being pushed into this. Mm-hmm. By the way, apparently there are even worse versions of this. There's the Gospel of Peter that more or less explicitly blames this on the Jews. The Jews take him away, and the Jews put him up on the cross, and Pilate's not so much involved in that. It's a lot more anti-Semitic than even than Matthew in many ways.
And again, going back to the idea of
you don't get the feeling that there's a lot of oppression, maybe in Jerusalem perhaps, but there's a lot of diversity, and they're far off in Galilee and other places. Trying to kind of do their own thing in some ways. So
sure, a lot of different sects. It's of course a lot of them are pushed out of Jerusalem, right? I mean, they're out in the wilderness, so to speak, like the Essenes, because they. I'm guessing it seems to me like they've been forced out in one way or the other.
Well, the Essenes are basically Sadducees who disagreed with the temple hierarchy, the temple people in charge of it, saying they're basically false priests. They're corrupt. Jesus is not new in this era of talking about, you made my Lord, my Father's house a den of thieves. Mm-hmm. The idea of the people, the priests running, the high priest running the temple in a corrupt way, where offices are bought and sold, goes back hundreds of years to the Hasmoneans and that sort of thing. So the idea that they're very corrupt and not religious and welcoming to the people is certainly true.
Yeah. Now, overall, then, in the in the New Testament, you go through. You start with the Gospels, and then you have this linchpin, so to speak, which is Acts,
right?
And then move on into the Pauline letters, and you show how there it's basically a journey that is moving away from the Jews and becoming anti-Semitic, and moving into into the Gentiles and becoming very pro-Gentile and non-Jewish at that point. How does Acts act in such a way of kind of bringing both the Gospels and the Pauline letters together?
Well, I think Acts is the most important book again in the New Testament. It gives the whole thing a structure. It gives it a theme. It gives it a journey, as you're saying, a point to the whole thing, and it does it from within, almost like a hub working in around there. Because, as you mentioned, the Pauline Epistles, these are written basically to Greeks, and mostly in Asia Minor and other places. He doesn't really talk, and they're early. They're in the 50s, before a lot of this antipathy between Jews and the budding Christians came about. He doesn't really talk about this conflict. He doesn't really say that much about Jews, yay or nay. He says a certain amount about the Gentiles trying to live the law of Moses, which he doesn't like. But it's almost asemitic in some way. It's just not dealing with Jews whatsoever. But the book of Acts changes everything, because it's certainly believed, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, that the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written by the same person. There's a lot of the style, there's a lot of the references that fit that way. And they're set up in this kind of chiastic connection, where the Gospel of Luke, like the other synoptics, basically starts far off in Galilee, far away from these things, moves through Samaria, then through Judea, and then finally ends up in Jerusalem. And there Jesus is crucified. And it's, to me, the book of Acts, I call it a big bang, because now you've gone down to this singularity, and now it's going to explode. And by Jesus's own commandment in the first chapter of Acts. They then go from Jerusalem to Judea to Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. So it sets up this thing like, this is the day of the Jew, and these are all the things that they've done wrong, which then Acts, the Gospels kind of hint a lot about the culpability of Jesus's death and that sort of thing, but Acts does not. It's very explicit, and then Acts takes it and kind of moves it away off to the farthest point, more or less ends up, and then sets the stage for these epistles, because the epistles, then, if they talk about, they're only talking to the Gentiles, that's almost proof that the gospel and the covenant, God's covenant, is now no longer with the Jews, it's now with the Gentiles, the Greeks, and they're the only people that are really important. So it creates this kind of anti-Semitic structure, I believe, to the whole New Testament, that moves, from the Jews. The first chapter is the Jewish era, and the next chapter is the Gentile era. And one of the crucial points of the whole book of Acts is when Paul gives up on the Jews and says, "I go now to the Gentiles," and that's almost like he's taking the covenant with them. And this is the whole idea of supersessionism, that the covenant people are no longer the Jews. They have killed Jesus. They have sinned so long that they're now rejected of God. And now these new Christians are now the covenant of people. That's the whole idea of supersessionism, that they've been replaced, just as the law of Moses has now been replaced by the gospel of Christ.
Well, I mean, that is true, though, isn't it? Right? I mean, the gospel of Christ is superseding, in a sense, at least at that point, the law of Moses, which has been fulfilled. But, and I'll get to you in a minute, I don't know what you're thinking right now, but what
I don't agree anyway.
Isn't he, look, he's fulfilled the law, being the law of Moses. There is also at the time, and I can read this in the Book of Mormon too, and especially in First Nephi, where there is it's not just a pro-Mosaic mood that Nephi gives us. It almost seems to me like it is an olive branch to Laman and Lemuel, who are like the Jews at Jerusalem, right, at the time, which is going to be similar to, I think, what we might see at the time of Christ. And again, who are the Jews? I want to get into that in just a minute. But something very similar there is happening, where it seems to me like Nephi is giving an olive branch as he explains to them about going back to Jerusalem and why they need to go back and why they need to follow the spirit of prophecy and revelation. And he brings up Moses and the Red Sea, etc., which actually ties right into the beginning of, I think it's D&C section 8. It's pretty interesting. But Moses, for most Jews today even, right, is kind of like the icon.
Sure.
And been elevated. So as I read the Gospels, what I'm seeing there, as far as something that is anti-Mosaic, I would read it more as the Jews have put this in the time of Christ, have put Moses at the top, whereas they have removed, whereas we're trying to show you that Jesus Christ should be at the top. And this is the kind of the rivalry between what is of Moses and what is of Jesus.
I see most of the law of Moses leading us to God, not to Moses. I mean, they talk about, even today, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, and there's a certain reverence for him, but there's also an idea that he's always leading us to God, and is not the person that they worship.
So you don't see that there could be like a rivalry, a theological rivalry that's going on there in the Gospels?
I see a rivalry between what people believe is the gospel of Christ and the law of Moses. And they're trying to put down the law of Moses as, well, you get this in the book of Hebrews a lot, that this is a shadow of true things. It's not, it's a lot of sacrifices, and Jesus only had to do it once. He's the great high priest, and, all these sorts of things. It really tries to make the case to the inferiority of the Mosaic system of sacrifices, especially. I don't think the law of Moses is done away with.
Okay.
I mean, and you don't get this on the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, he says, it says they of old time not to murder people. I say you shouldn't be angry. Well, he's still saying not to murder people. He's not undermining that sort of thing. That's still in effect. When he cures people, he still tells them to go to the temple and to present themselves before the priests and that sort of thing. I see this as basically another chapter. I mean, there's so many things in the law of Moses. The idea of love your neighbor as yourself, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. That's all Deuteronomy and Leviticus. There's what we would consider eternal principles all throughout the 5 books of Moses, and it's the foundation to all the other scriptures. It's just that you now add some other thing. You take it a little. You're intensifying. You're adding it a little bit more to that sort of thing. Even in the Book of Mormon, Jesus comes and says you no more have to do blood sacrifices. But he doesn't say anything about the moral commandments, that these are not in effect the ethical commandments. Doesn't say anything about the holidays either, for that matter. Just that now he has done the sacrifice. The blood sacrifices are done away with, but there's a whole lot left to the Old Testament. I mean, the law of Moses besides sacrifices, ethical commandments, commandments on how to live that really lead us to a Zion-like law of consecration, that sort of thing.
So, I mean, of course, he also says, "Look, I haven't come to destroy the law.
Right.
I'm here to fulfill it." So he's
but
not
the
destroying
traditional
the law.
Christian thing is that he has destroyed it. It's gone. You don't have, and fulfill, it can mean complete, but it's still in effect, and you're taking it onward.
But we don't follow the law of Moses today in the church. I mean, there's principles that we follow, but we don't go back to it as a list of the 600 plus commandments that we need to follow.
Well, the 613 commandments, most of them have to do with the Mosaic temple and sacrifices, but we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. We're supposed to love the Lord with all our heart. We don't follow a kosher law per se, but we have the law, a word of wisdom that's very similar. We have tithing, it's very similar. We have temples, which to me, I've been a temple worker here in Raleigh for 3 or 4 years, and I find all sorts of simple similarities between the Mosaic temple and our temple as far as the way it teaches us. There's things about don't put a stumbling block before the blind, don't oppress the poor, open your hand to the poor. I mean, there's all sorts of things in there that seem to me very eternal principles.
Sure. No, I agree with that 100%. We might have some other disagreements in there, but as far as eternal principles, of course, I believe that that's true.
Right. But in traditional Christianity, it's like this was a completely a law of spite. Is given to them to just tell them that it's right or wrong. You can't follow it. It's too many rules. It's not going to save you. And thank goodness it's done with. This is traditional Christian doctrine. And now we have the freedom of the law of Jesus. And now we can do all the things that the Greeks and Romans wanted to do. They can work on Sunday. They can eat all sorts of different things. It's really a Gentilization of the Jewish law, it seems to me.
It's interesting. Okay. Going into the Paul's
That's something
letter.
I might regret saying later on. Anyway.
No, it's an interesting take. It's a very interesting take. I'm getting more and more of the idea of kind of the filter that you're looking through. Paul's epistles, written in Greek for Greeks. These epistles instead focus on Gentile issues. And then you say this, you say the Pauline epistles cannot be read by themselves. In other words, I think what you're saying is you've got to bring context in here. I'm guessing what you're saying is that the context here from the Gospels and especially from Acts has got to be brought in.
Sure,
to understand.
especially Acts. Acts tells you why he was in Ephesus, why he was in Corinth, what was going on, and especially the idea that he has now left the Jews. The Jews, dusted my feet.
Let me play the devil's advocate here for a second.
You wouldn't do that on me. Come on.
So as Paul typically goes into these different cities, he's preaching to the Jews, right? He usually starts by going to the synagogues and tries to speak with them. He gets into some trouble there, but seems to be, not always, but seems to be mostly rejected, as you would think, because they're Jews and they're going to believe in Judaism as it is. And then he goes out it seems, to the other Gentiles. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have letters and communication of, hey, we've got a bunch of people here who happen to be Gentiles. You need to come to this city and preach here. That might be the case, but he does, at least the letters, the way they're written, he does seem to try to preach to the Jews when he goes to those cities, doesn't he?
That's all Acts.
That's all Acts. Okay.
Yeah, that's Acts. Acts is the idea. He comes in, he goes to the synagogue, he preaches to them, they hate him, throw him out, and he goes to the Gentiles. That's Acts.
Okay, you're right.
And scholars have pointed this out, that in the epistles, it's a little bit of a different story. You don't have him doing that sort of. You have him seeming say, I've come here, I've worked among you, and possibly as a tent maker or something. I've gotten to know you, and it's a lot more of a low key thing, not very confrontational.
But do we believe Acts that he did try that in those cities? But do we believe in what is written in Acts that he did try to teach to the Jews in those cities?
Well, you have to filter that out. Again, I mean, all the biblical scholars I know about accept 7 of those letters of Paul as absolute fact that they were written by Paul. And so they base whereas you've got the writer of Acts, doing some embellishment, that sort of thing. So they're really kind of trying to figure out what's going in Acts through those letters that they know.
But if it's written by Luke, isn't he basically being mentored by Paul?
That's the tradition.
Okay. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, you just get a very different picture through the epistles than you do.
Okay, that's fair.
I find it hard to like Paul from Acts, because he's challenging Peter. He's claiming.
He's not real easy to get along with.
I'm now getting a little bit confused. I think it's Acts that says he goes back to the apostles and talks to them, whereas it's in is it Galatians, where he says he goes to Arabia and has nothing to do with the other apostles.
I think that is, for what, 3 years?
That sort of thing. So it's kind of like he's a bit of a
2 or 3 years,
a loose cannon in many ways. And he sets himself as, I have the right way of taking it to the Gentiles. This is how you're doing it, and you guys have to just kind of get in line, follow me in some way. Yeah. So,
well, is it a lot of? Wouldn't you say that a lot of the Christian theology and tradition is mostly from the Pauline letters?
Certainly, Protestantism. I mean, you've got Romans is the big thing for Luther and Calvin and the rest of them. All these ideas about saved by grace, and by that mean by nothing that has to do with you, but by simply from God. Their ideas of faith,
they're misreading
very much Pauline, and their feelings about the law of Moses. Whereas there's a number of scholars again recently who just looked at these things again and says it has to do with or setting up a separate covenant, that there's Jews can come to the God through the Mosaic law, and that's connected with Jesus, and then the Gentiles can have to do separately a little bit more through faith in Jesus. So they set this up as almost two peoples with two different kinds of ways, paths to God.
Yeah. Again, I think that one of the big issues with I think it's the same. I say the same thing at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, which I think you're going to dispute. But I think it's to me, it's a matter of saying, here's what's being believed right now in Jerusalem. We don't believe all of these things, and so we're going to teach something a little bit different. And it's a reaction to what is in Jerusalem. And when I say Jerusalem, again, what I'm saying is those that are in power, both from theological standpoint, the court, and from those that have the real wealth and power. That's who I'm talking about, and who would have control over the scriptures, etc. But I see a move to go and the whole move against works that we see, for example, in Paul. So many people just put that directly in with the law of Moses. That's what they're fighting against. And that's what they mean about works. And to a certain degree, that's true. I think that you get the same thing with Luther, right? When Luther is protesting the Catholic Church, it's against works, and he looks at their rituals, and we shouldn't be doing all these things. That's what Paul said. I think it's overdone, and because I think what they're really doing is they're contrasting themselves with what had been going on with the law of Moses, and bringing in a new teaching. So they're trying to create in the Gospels and in Paul, they're going against what's normative at the time, right? And trying to bring in something new. I think I see Nephi doing the same thing. It seems to me, again, with Laman and Lemuel, who I think represent the beliefs of those in power in Jerusalem at roughly 600 BC. To me, it's the same thing. But let me ask you this as we go into the Book of Mormon here, because we're taking already a long time on this. But
I can't comment on this. Come on.
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
I
mean, in many ways, as far as the Jews of Jerusalem, the pre-captivity Jews, I agree with you. I mean, Ezekiel is quite condemnatory of the Jews and the priests. The temple is corrupt. He has these visions of going into the temple and
Jeremiah
doing all
too.
sorts of idolatrous things. And and Jeremiah certainly is at least as vituperative, but so they are setting themselves off from the corruption in Jerusalem. The corruption in Jerusalem, which they think is bringing about the Babylonian captivity. The wickedness is coming, that sort of thing. So they're certainly doing that.
Who are the Jews?
Who are the Jews?
Who are the Jews? You've already given me an example that there's been a replacement of Pharisees being used at times for the Jews. Who are the Jews? Because here's what I see when I go to the Book of Mormon.
In the Book of Mormon?
No. I mean, totally, universally, because it's when I go to the Book of Mormon and I read especially Nephi, which is a reason why I think those small places are in there. He oftentimes speaks of the Jews as if he is not a Jew. Right now, he's not, are the Jews from the tribe of Judah? Are the Jews from the kingdom of Judah? Are they, later on in Judea, as we would call it? Who are the Jews? I mean, looking from a New Testament perspective and looking from a Book of Mormon perspective, who are the Jews?
You'd have to look at the context. I think it's interesting to me that the most condemnatory ideas about the Jews. Where am I? I have a nice little thing here somewhere. Yeah. You got Nephi saying, I, Nephi, have not taught them many things concerning the manner of the Jews, for their works were works of darkness and their doings were doings of abominations. That, you look at the tense. He's using the past tense. These are the Jews before him. These are the Jews at Jerusalem. And these are the ones he's condemning. It isn't go from all time. This is just what those Jews are like. So in that sense, the Jews are members of the kingdom of Judah, basically. Same thing with Jacob. Again, the Jews were a stiff-necked people, and they despised the words of plainness and killed the prophets and sought for things. Again, all the past tense. So in that sense, the Jews are these pre-captivity citizens of the kingdom of Judah, that sort of thing. Whereas later on, he'll talk about the Jews in the present tense or even the future tense. And I think he's talking about another group. And even, when he talks about, he defines the Jews when he talks about, I have charity for the Jews. But, by them, I mean the ones I have left behind. So he's kind of defining that. But he does use it kind of loosely. And I have to think that aside from the specific times when he's talking about the Jews that he left behind in Jerusalem, this is, again, the Book of Mormon is an ancient book written for a modern audience. So I think these are the Jews of our era. When he talks about that they understand the things of the scriptures better than other people, and we need to learn how they do. I think they're talking about the Jews in our time in many ways. Because scripturally, Jews can mean descendants of Judah. They can mean people who lived in the kingdom of Judea. They can mean people who ascribe to Judaism today, or anybody who calls themselves a Jew. There's lots of different ways of doing this. But I think when it's not clear that he's talking about the ancient Jerusalemites, he's talking about talking to the Jews of our era.
Yeah, it seems to me that that is true, that he may be talking about different groups. It seems to me that primarily, even in the Gospels and especially in the Book of Mormon, when he's talking past tense, that he's talking about the aristocracy primarily. I'm not saying that there aren't others that would follow that, but it seems to me like he's talking about the power brokers that have got control of the city and even the church and the theology at that time. But because is Nephi a Jew?
He said so.
Okay. So he says he's a Jew, yet he talks other times as if he's not a Jew. He talks about
I get
them.
this in 2 Nephi 34. He talks about the Book of Mormon coming forth, the plates and that sort of thing. He says, and then shall a remnant of our seed know concerning us how we came out of Jerusalem and that we are descendants of the Jews.
That we are descendants of the Jews. Yeah.
Yes.
So again, he's using different definitions all the times, because he's not talking about when, even in Moroni, in the title page of the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites, who are obviously Lehites, they would be Jews then, if that's the case. And yet they're distinguished as Lamanites, which I would see as, a remnant of the house of Israel, as separate from the Jews. Those are two distinct groups that we get from the title page from Moroni.
And you kind of think that it has something to do with people who know or think that they're Jews, and people like Lamanites who don't realize they have an Israelite heritage, that they're that sort of thing. There does seem to be a different circumstance, but
so your idea then, the Jews are all of the children of Israel?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I don't know what the Gadites are doing or what's happening there, but I think it's very helpful to think of the Book of Mormon in terms of these are Jewish people, and they're dealing with Jewish issues that overlap with the New Testament and the Old Testament. Okay. And not to think of, I've heard this in the past, that they're Israelites, which are different from Jews, because Jews are corrupt hypocrites and they're all like this, but Israelites somehow, have transcended that.
I don't allude to that at all, but I just think because you still do get the rivalry, pretty strong rivalry throughout the Book of Mormon between the Mulekites, who are direct descendants of Judah, along with the Josephites, the Ephraimites of the Lehites, of the Nephites. And that continues throughout the entire Book of Mormon. And
it says, the Mulekites were more numerous than the Lamanites, but they become united as a people. And the Mulekites are all, they could be of different backgrounds, but if they follow Mulek, they're very likely come from the kingdom of Judah and possibly of the line of the tribe of Judah. So there's got a huge amount of people who are, by that definition, Jews as well.
Exactly. I mean, if there's all that mixing that's going on there, then you've got, so to speak, the stick of Judah and the stick of Ephraim, of Joseph. At least they're together. Right. The Book of Mormon. Then let's finish off going into the Book of Mormon.
We're going to go to the Book of Mormon after this.
How does the Book of Mormon recover this perception for Christianity of a positive outlook and a reconciliation with the Jewish people?
Okay, but before we do that, let me just kind of finish up with the anti-Semitism in the New Testament again.
Sure.
I think it was, when they were written, the Gospels and that sort of thing had an anti-Semitic bent to them, but it was a somewhat benign, because it was a small, impotent group that's basically trying to bolster their confidence that they're doing the right thing, that this is, and that they have a place even with all this persecution and that sort of thing. It becomes basically then weaponized when Christianity becomes the norm in the Roman Empire, and then throughout the New Testament, where a lot of these things are used ritually to incite hatred against Jews. And it's also contributed by the fact that Jews are being, kicked out of England in 1290, and in France, and there are always these strange people, these almost like gypsies who move around and they don't fit in. And Christianity has preserved that. So I don't think it was intended, certainly, to bring about the Holocaust. I don't think it was intended to bring about the atrocities that happened in Russia or in the Crusades. I think the writers of the New Testament, and certainly the people they wrote about, would be absolutely horrified that any of their words and teachings were used in this way. So you've got kind of benign anti-Semitism, as there is such a thing, and then it just explodes and is used for other purposes. So how does the Book of Mormon?
There's some anti-Semitism that comes across in the writings in the New Testament, but especially there's a malinterpretation of carrying that forward through the centuries through Christianity.
Sure. I mean, at that time, it may have been somewhat of an intra-family thing. I mean, you're disputing this within yourself, and you're not meaning to then have it to lead to violence and persecution. So anyway.
How does the Book of Mormon correct this?
I think the Book of Mormon corrects it the very way that the New Testament promotes it. Again, I think it's, if you look at the New Testament, there are these statements like the blood be upon us and our children. There are portrayals of Pharisees and Sadducees and even the law of Moses that contribute to this. I think there are certain settings of things such as the Sermon on the Mount and other places that contribute the otherness of Christianity versus Judaism, and again the structure. And I think the Book of Mormon changes all these things. There are certainly very strong statements in Second Nephi 29 about what thank they the Jews for all that they've done, and the people the Gentiles who persecuted them will be condemned themselves. There are very, very strong statements against, and Jesus talks about no more game, or that's I don't want to look at it initially, but no more play sport with the Jews or go after them. Plus, there's a very clear statement that they are not superseded, that they continue to be not only the ancient people of God, but God's covenant people. Jesus says this, Nephi says this, God says it in several places. So it outright refutes the idea of supersessionism. And then the portrayals. If you think of these people as Jews, Nephites are occasionally susceptible to Pharisee-like hypocrisy, but others are not, and other people repent of that sort of thing. So occasional hypocrisy is not an innate thing that you can't get rid of. You can't change it. So it argues against that portrayal of Pharisees. Lamanites on occasion are very murderous, but they can repent and change, just as the Jews in the New Testament are portrayed as being murderous. I think as far as the law of Moses, rather than these caricatures of these different things, you have in the Book of Mormon, even though they're not named, very valid and helpful and spiritual uses of things such as a Passover, of Rosh Hashanah, of Sukkot early on in the Book of Mormon, of these things where you see that the law of Moses is not just an empty shell that promotes hypocrisy and doesn't really promote good behavior and spiritual things, but it can indeed do these sorts of things.
By the way, where do you see Rosh Hashanah in the Book of Mormon?
I see it in the beginning. Your friend Don Bradley will disagree with me, but I see it in the beginning with this is the commencement of the reign of Zedekiah. There are many different kinds of years in Judaism. They're just like we have a calendar year, a fiscal year, a school year. They have different years, and one of them begins on Rosh Hashanah in the fall. And that's a preliminary to Yom Kippur. And this is a time when there's a lot of preparation for this atoning sort of thing. There's a lot of emphasis on repentance and change and improvement and making things better. And I see that's happening not only with Lehi praying for the people, but also the other prophets in the land who come to call the people to repentance. You don't see much of Yom Kippur because the people don't repent. So the atonement really isn't valid for them. But then when he goes off you've got Rosh Hashanah, 10 days later, you have Yom Kippur, and then a week or so later you have Sukkot or Tabernacles.
5 days later, yeah.
And the whole idea of Tabernacles, you got Lehi living in a tent, how prominent that is with the sacrifices and it's a harvest festival. You have some of those sorts of things, but there's also the emphasis on the journey, going to a promised land. That's the whole idea of living in this hut. You're dependent upon God. You're vulnerable to God, but you're moving with God towards a promised land, and that's what the people are doing there. So.
All right, I'm going to reread First Nephi with that in mind and see what comes to mind, because that's pretty interesting to me. You know, where
Don presents some arguments I'm still working on, but I still think there's a lot in the context, especially if you think of this as a Book of Mormon as an ancient book written to modern readers. There's a lot that someone who comes from a Jewish perspective would see this pattern of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot in the first part.
Yeah, he does see that in getting the gold plates from Moroni, but
it's more of a party sort of thing. So Laban getting drunk, it makes sense to me. But the other part is the structure, because it seems to me the New Testament presents you with two chapters. There's the age of the Jews and how they sin, and then there's the rise of the Gentiles. And it's more or less set up as these two. The Book of Mormon adds another complete chapter to this of the return. Of the Jews will return. They will be gathered again to their lands, and they'll reach the sorts of things that they need to do. So the Book of Mormon adds that chapter. I mean, even again, you get the idea of the Acts going from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Well, the Book of Mormon has that as well. They start in Jerusalem, they go to the wilderness, they go to Bountiful, and then you can go more to the ends of the earth than go to America. But throughout the whole thing, there's a sense of return, that they will come back, that they will be gathered again. So it adds another chapter to this. So I think it structurally, and has it, the Book of Mormon has its foot in both the Old Testament and the New Testament world. It works between and then restructures this whole narrative, it seems to me.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I see Rosh Hashanah in Alma and Amulek, the people of Ammonihah. I think that is the Feast of Trumpets, and they're there gathered together. A bunch of people are there. They may not be in Zarahemla, but maybe they didn't make the trek. They don't want to make the trek. They're kind of separatists at that point anyway. But that's what it looks like to me, or at least it's written in that vein.
It wouldn't surprise me, and people see Sukkot in King Benjamin's era, where he's the coronation of his son, basically.
Absolutely,
this is a Sukkot sort of thing.
Yeah. All right. Here's what I see in the Book of Mormon, and this makes me think of this as I read your book. Is there one of the big differences between the New Testament then and the Book of Mormon? You have in the New Testament definite references to Isaiah, right? From Christ, from Jesus getting in the synagogue to start his ministry, over and over again, right from the get-go, you've got Isaiah there, but it's a messianic Isaiah, right? It's a messianic Isaiah. In the Book of Mormon, you get the messianic Isaiah, but you also get the gathering of Israel Isaiah all over the place that you may not see nearly as much in the Gospels. Why do you think that would be?
Well,
and does that contribute to the difference between the Book of Mormon and the New Testament?
Yeah, I mean, you wanted me to talk about this, and then let's see what it's. I guess it's First Nephi 13, the relationship between the New Testament and the Book of Mormon. But the Book of Mormon, I think, is a corrective to the New Testament in some ways. It gives us it's more of a touchstone of how we can approach the New Testament for these sorts of things. And you're talking about Isaiah. Matthew uses Isaiah a lot, but it's in reference to his mortal ministry. It's the Christ sort of thing. Whereas the Book of Mormon, most of it, especially in those huge blocks in Nephi, it's has to do with what I would call the Messianic era. It is a gathering, but that's part of the Messianic era, the gathering of Israel, the establishment of a time where there is no war. We will learn no more war, and how Jesus will preside over this sort of thing. It's really a second coming sort of prophecy. The big scripture on Jesus's ministry is Isaiah 53. You don't get that in Nephi. You get that in Mosiah with Abinadi. kind of slid in there. So all these things were Nephi is trying to tell you about Jesus and about the plan and about he fits in, is all about this messianic era Messiah who will come and the gathering of Israel in this last chapter, rather than the mortal ministry. I think it has a much better view. I mean, this is something I've learned from studying with my Jewish friends and that sort of thing, that the idea of the Messiah, even in Christian sense, is not simply his sacrifice for sin and his mortal ministry. It's his idea that he will preside over an earth of a time of justice, peace, and mercy and equality. And you get that in spades in Fourth Nephi. And Fourth Nephi is this mini messianic era.
So in that chapter, First Nephi 13, is the book that proceeds forth from the mouth of a Jew. Is that the entire Bible? Is that the Old Testament and the New Testament?
All right.
Or is it one of the other?
And it says, and he said, behold, it proceedeth forth out of the mouth of a Jew. And I, Nephi, beheld it. And he said unto me, the book that thou beholdest is a record of the Jews, which contains the covenants of the Lord, which he had made to the house of Israel. It also containeth many of the prophecies of the holy prophets. And it is a record like unto the engravings upon the brass plates, save there are not so many. So it has to include what we would call Old Testament, up to Jeremiah. It has to, and they refer to that at the beginnings of the year. So it has to be part of the Old Testament.
Is it only the Old Testament?
That's what?
Is it only the Old Testament?
I don't believe so, because later on in 24, the angel of the Lord said unto me, thou hast beheld that the book proceedeth forth from the mouth of a Jew. And when it proceeded forth from the mouth of a Jew, it contained the fullness of the gospel, of whom the 12 apostles bear record. So there's a reference to the 12 apostles. I think it has to do with their account. And even in 26, and after they go forth by the hand of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. I think it's inclusive. I think it's what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, as well as the New Testament. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that in verse 40 in this same chapter, this is 1 Nephi 13, and it's talking about the Book of Mormon. And the angel spake unto me, saying, these last records which thou hast seen among the Gentiles shall establish the truth of the first, which are of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now, I have heard this interpreted, meaning the Book of Mormon simply says everything in the New Testament is true. That's how it establishes the truth. But I think it's more discerning, that it'll show you what is true about the New Testament and what is not. Because then it says, and shall make known the plain and precious things which have been taken away from them. So it's a little bit of like, again, the Book of Mormon is a touchstone. The Book of Mormon, doesn't talk about all the Jews killing Jesus. So that's a corrective. It talks again, it doesn't talk about the Jews being superseded. It talks again about the Jews being part of that covenant. So that's something that the Book of Mormon is correcting about the New Testament. Interestingly, where is that phrase? You've heard the phrase, except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Do you recall where that is?
I don't remember. Isn't that the end of his ministry?
Sermon on the Mount. It's Matthew 5.
Oh, it's the beginning.
But
okay.
It's not in the Sermon on the Mount in 3rd Nephi. So again, I mean, there's things in there
pertain to them, of course.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of extraneous. That really has anything to do with the Sermon on the Mount. You can still read those principles and apply them and live a more holy life. Why was that even thrown in there? It's like this little jab, but it isn't in the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense.
If you start, I mean, we in the church are not particularly sensitive to this because we don't emphasize this in our gospel doctrine classes. We skip over, but there's a lot of these principles that Jesus teaches that are beautiful and wonderful. And then there's this little jab, be true to your neighbor, unlike the Pharisees, these things in there. And we're not aware of that because we're not eventually either emphasizing it or reading it or even thinking about it when we read about it. So.
Sure. It doesn't affect us. I mean, it's understood.
Well, in a way it does affect us, but yeah, we don't talk about it.
I mean, not directly in that sense, right? I mean,
right.
we're not offended by it.
That's true.
Yeah, we're not offended by it.
Thanks.
Finishing up here, I wanted to bring up in your book, you bring up, and this is obviously because there are so many references to the Jews in the Book of Mormon in this area here, but the small plates, you talk a lot about First Nephi, you go into Jacob 5, and I think Jacob 4 too, and I hadn't realized this before, but this is where the emphasis is on the Jews. And obviously they're coming out of Jerusalem. It's fresh to them, obviously, but it's
There's a
not
lot in
just
Third
that.
Nephi
I mean,
too,
you've
but
got all of Isaiah packed into Second Nephi also.
Right.
And you've got Jacob with the allegory of Zenos in there. How important is this for the Jews in the last days and for our relationship with the Jews, for the small plates who have been added in here above and beyond Mormon's abridgment?
I think it's absolutely vital, important. I can't talk about it so much. Again, Don Bradley will probably disagree with me, but I think of the 116 pages as almost a rough draft. I mean, this is the stuff to become aware of this, to learn this sort of thing. But God knew that this was going to happen, and he got to teach Joseph Smith an important lesson, and kept the best part for later. I think this is not a plan B as far as it's inferior. I think it's much, much superior than some of the. Again, I don't really know what's in the 116 pages, but again, like you say, I concentrate on especially First Nephi, Second Nephi. There's just some beautiful, beautiful things, and you get it firsthand. It's much more moving to me with coming from Nephi directly. Some people are annoyed with him, and I think you probably should be at a certain point. But you see someone who is basically concerned about his sins, who's worried about him, about the things that he does, that wants to do better, that's improving, that's changing. I'm
just think
glad it comes from him because I like him.
Well, again, I mean, going back to our original, the beginning of the interview, we don't think that much. We don't talk that much about this reconciliation with the Jews. We talk about the gathering of Israel, and of course that's a part of it. But as far as the idea of thinking of today's Jews and how this Book of Mormon is supposed to eventually speak directly to them, right? How is it that this is going to speak directly to them? And I think that's a fresh way to look at the Book of Mormon, because it is the tool, apparently, that is going to eventually speak to them.
And it works very well. This gets into my other book, Beholding the Tree of Life. But if you read the Torah and then the other prophet, there's a narrative, there's a storyline that goes all the way through it, and Jews typically, many of the Jews approach this as a story, as a narrative, where you're looking at characterization, you're looking at the changes, you're looking at setting, you're taking the words very, very seriously and how they relate to each other along the way. Well, the Book of Mormon is itself also a narrative. So it really fits this literary approach very well, how people develop and that sort of thing. So these techniques that Jews have used for thousands of years on the Hebrew scriptures work very well for the Book of Mormon. As opposed to the New Testament. I mean, you don't approach epistles the same way you would a story. It's not that way. And even in the Gospels, there's a sense of, certainly at the end, you have a narrative of how Jesus is, the process of being crucified and what happens there. But before that, it's almost like just a set of parables or sermons,
lessons
that don't really have a context, and in fact are switched around within the New Testament. I mean, even like the Sermon on the Mount, as beautiful as it is, why are these people there? What gave Jesus the idea to say these things? Were there something in his past that he learned these things well? And then what happened afterwards? How did these people react? What happened? Did it change their lives? What happened to him in his ministry? It's just, things are just kind of plopped, these pericopes they're called, in there like beads on a string, and they can be manipulated. You don't approach the New Testament the same way you would the Old Testament, but you do with the Book of Mormon. You can read the whole thing through, and you can see changes in in Nephi. And you can see why the impact of King Benjamin's speech on the servant king, and how that would have affected his king, his son, and why Mosiah eventually gave up the kingship, because he's then thinking of the people much like his father. And there's so much there that it really works if you come to it from that same sort of thing. And unfortunately, I think oftentimes we members of the church approach the Book of Mormon like the New Testament. It's a book of Bartlett's quotations that we can pick and choose and send to other people, or bits of doctrine that we know about.
Bumper stickers.
And we don't read the whole story. I at one point I got a hold of a facsimile version of the Book of Mormon, and that was probably there are other books that are like that now, but that was the only thing there. And it's it's one column. There's no footnotes, no comments on the side. You read it like you read a novel, and just the sweep of the whole thing was incredibly moving to see how this works, and you can kind of see it in a larger sense. So
that sounds like a great experience.
It was.
Well, Bradley, is there anything else you wanted to get in here before we sign off here?
I guess the major point of this particular book is that I think if you look at the New Testament, and it's hard for us to do that, because I think as members of the church, especially in the last several decades, we've connected more and more with traditional Christians and evangelicals, and we've started to think in terms of the New Testament the same way they do, as something perfect and complete and sacrosanct, and that's not typically the way our theology and doctrine have approached it. But the Book of Mormon takes that sort of thing, and then it counters this wave of kind of supersessionist ideas and elements, and counters it with a tsunami the other way. But it does it without undermining the New Testament. The bad things that it talks about the Jews in the New Testament could therefore simply be something that happened at that time, and not a universal attribute of Jews from all time. It could be, it puts it in a little more of a limited context. We didn't talk much about interfaith relations, but I think the Book of Mormon, as far as like converting the Jews, I was a missionary. I was tasked to somehow teach the Jews something about the gospel with the hopes of maybe baptizing them. That didn't happen. I learned a lot, I talked a lot, but I also, in the process, kind of really, I felt that it's almost none of our business. And I get this from the Book of Mormon too, because I think Jesus again talks a lot about the Jews, and especially in what chapter are we in here? Chapter 16 of 3rd Nephi. He says, "Then I gather them from the four corners of the earth. Then will I fulfill the covenant which the Father hath made unto all the people of the house of Israel. And then will I remember my covenant which I have made unto my people, O house of Israel. And I will bring my gospel unto them." There's this I thing. And I think it's really, the Book of Mormon is really saying, and Jesus is saying in this, that it's his problem. I mean, in some ways, he came to earth in a way that was not predicted very well by Isaiah and the rest of the prophets. So in a sense, he created that problem. Also, Christianity, traditional Christianity, has so messed up the Jewish idea of Jesus and who he is and his church is, that it's almost beyond human repair, but it's not beyond divine repair. And I think he's kind of saying that this is my problem. I'll deal with it. It's your duty as Christians, as members of the church, to love and have charity for the Jews, to learn from them, to treat them respectfully as friends, and not to not to pressure them, not to missionize them, not to come up with projects and that sort of thing. There are different sort of people in a different situation, and I will take care of it. He seems almost possessive. And I love the part, and again, in 3rd Nephi 21, that Jesus shall gather them from their long dispersion, my people, O house of Israel, and shall again establish again among them my Zion. He seems very possessive, that this is something he does. And this, kind of coincides with my experiences. I've participated in Torah and Talmud classes and gone to different worship services at synagogues and that sort of thing. Many of the Jews are very hesitant about me and very apprehensive, because this is a Mormon guy who's known for missionizing and that sort of thing. And I had to make it clear to them, and they kind of watched me. And it's just, as I've treated with them with respect, and they've treated me with respect. If I learned about their religion, they have questions about mine. And it's been this wonderful kind of simple, friendly exchange that I think is in keeping with what Jesus is saying in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Anyway.
Great. Appreciate that. I've had the opportunity to do a little bit of interfaith out in Orange County, California. Worked with the church group out there, and then I'm involved with a local synagogue here as well. So it's a lot of fun, and it's really, it gives you just a new, fresh perspective on things that does not always contradict what you believe as a member of the LDS Church, but it actually enriches it and gives you some context, and it's kind of nice.
I agree. I'm definitely a believer in the Book of Mormon, that it's the divine origin and you can get divine messages from it. But I think too often that we've approached it from a Protestant perspective, because that's where many of the members came from. We've looked at it from that slant. And yet, if I look, as I learn about Judaism and approach it from that another side, I see another whole aspect of the Book of Mormon that really brings it to life and expands it. The idea, Judaism, for instance, talks about the Sabbath being a delight, obeying the commandments as being a delight. They even have, after their services on Friday, the Reformed Jews have an Oneg Shabbat, which is a Sabbath delight, and they get together and schmooze and eat things like that. And that's changed me. I've looked at the Sabbath more as how can this be a delightful, wonderful thing where I can do things that I can't do it normally. I can study the scriptures more. I can relate to my family. I can be with them and see it more as a happiness. And in retrospect, I then looked at the Book of Mormon and how often is delight and delightsome in there. And I really hadn't noticed it until this.
Interesting. Yeah.
So
very nice. Well, Bradley, thanks so much for coming on. Really do appreciate it. In regards to the Jewish approach to the Book of Mormon, I'm going to have you back on for another one of your books on the Tree of Life and the Book of Mormon, because that looks fascinating.
After this discussion, I look forward to it. I hope I've been somewhat coherent.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.